Okay, with it being about 3 minutes after the top of the hour, we're going to go ahead and get started. As some of the other participants make their way here, we'll be sure to let them in. But I want to be respectful of your time as attendees and, of course, the time of our presenters. My name is Dr. Malcolm Glover. I'll be your facilitator for this case study session where we learn more about the Schott Foundation for Public Education. It is a national public fund serving as a bridge between philanthropic partners and advocates to build movements to provide all students an opportunity to learn. Our presenters for this session are Dr. Leah Austin, who joined the SHOT team on April 20th, 2020, as the director of the National Opportunity to Learn Network. In that role, she works with grantees and stakeholders to support effective campaigns focused on building systems to provide all students an opportunity to learn through philanthropic support and other strategic capacity building resources. And Marianna Islam, who joined the Schott Foundation for Public Education as the Director of Programs and Advocacy in March 2016. And in that role, Mariana works with program staff to develop and implement the Foundation's resource delivery strategy, including the provision of grant-making communications, network building, and policy advocacy supports. We'll hear a lot more from both of our presenters. But first, we did want to go through some community guidelines, and then we'll have a brief icebreaker for everyone. So some things to remember for this session are as follows. When we get into the presentation and discussions, we want to make sure that everyone remembers that words matter. So keep in mind that the words that you use can often have an impact on people. Use I statements. Your experience is yours, and please honor and respect the experiences of others. We want to share the mic. Now, of course, all of us are using our desktop or laptop computers. We're not all in the same room, but we want to make sure that so many of the different voices who are a part of this discussion are able to be heard. We want to hear from your experiences, and we want to hear questions from you. Also, too, be aware of the privilege that you hold. If you are accustomed to positions of relative power or privilege, recognize that there may be some others in this discussion who are not. We want to respect all views. Be present. Yes, we are in a virtual environment, but as much as possible, try to get rid of some of those distractions that may happen, whether it's the laundry or whatever else might be taking place. For those of you who are at home or in your office, be fully present in this session. It will make the session a whole lot better. We want you to know that what's said during this session, we are keeping confidential. So when you pose certain questions in the chat or make certain statements, that information will not be shared in terms of direct quotes. The information that we do capture is just for understanding efforts and important information that was gathered from this session, but no information will be attributed to specific people who participate. It's an important thing to remember. No pitching. As much as possible, try to check yourself on whether you are promoting something or attempting to influence others. And self-care is always going to be important. Sitting in front of the screen for too long can be draining, no matter how engaging the content may be or our presenters are. And I know that they are very engaging. Remember to stretch and move regularly and take a break if and when you need to. One more thing to mention before we move on to our icebreaker for today is that closed captioning is available for all participants. To access it, click the three dots on the bottom of your Zoom screen and then select either Show Subtitle to view captions on your Zoom screen or View Full Transcript to view the full live transcript from the Zoom event in a window to the right. So now it's time for our icebreaker. We think that this would be a great fun activity. You'll only be doing it for a few minutes, I think a total of 5 minutes, and then we'll bring you back. And the topic for the icebreaker is, what is the story of your name? What is the story of your name? Shannon, who is our fearless tech support expert, is going to help us get all of you into uh, breakout rooms. And so that is going to be the question. What is the story of your name? We want you to be able to talk about that with other participants, and then we'll bring everyone back and get right into our discussion. Thanks, everyone. I'm going to type that in the chat. What is the story of your name? That's what you'll be discussing in your breakout rooms.
Is this the breakout room?
I just sent a private message, but you know what? It's 8 of us. Why not just make this the breakout room? So, what is the story of your name? Who would like to share? Who'd like to go first? I guess as a facilitator, I should always be the first to take a bite of the apple. Uh, Actually, a few weeks ago, I had a chance to meet one of our presenters, Marianna Islam, and it's an interesting story. I think back to grade school, and I had to do this assignment, and it was asking my parents the origins of my name. And interestingly enough, there was no grand story. I was born in Malcolm Grow Hospital on Andrews Air Force Base, but that's not how I got the name Malcolm. My mom actually ended up saying, well, I always liked British sounding names. So that's how I became Malcolm Elliott. My sister is Lauren Hillary, and kind of the rest was history. No King Malcolm from Macbeth or anything like that. No Malcolm X, just Malcolm Elliott. Who'd like to go next?
I'll go next. Hi, everyone. I'm Emily Inslee. And my first name, the story of my first name is I didn't have one for like the first week after I was born because I guess the name my parents picked for me, they didn't like it. They didn't know if I was going to be a boy or girl. So all the pictures of me in the hospital, I'm just Girl Hansen. That's my maiden name, Hansen, actually. Same spelling as yours, Rob. And then they founded children's books with the name Emily and loved the name. So that's how I became Emily. They thought it was a unique name, but it turns out the year I was born, it was the #1 name of girls in America. So there are a lot of Emilys in my growing up. So that's me.
Thank you for sharing, Emily. Who would like to go next?
I can go next. I haven't the vaguest idea what the story is of my first name, but I'll tell you, but a name story is, so my maiden last name is Crystal. And it was very important to me, story of my current name, which is how I'll interpret this one, is that it was really important to me to maintain my personal identity through my maiden name, but also have shared identity with my husband and my children, to add that last name. And so we had, lots of discussions about what are we going to do. And so the story of my name is a constant set of corrections and vigilance in order to say to people that no, Crystal is not my first name, and my name is not Catherine Crystal like Mary Jane. It's Catherine Crystal Foster. And to say, God damn it, I'm going to use all three names all the time. And it's been a really interesting thing because especially when you have a multi-syllabic name, like it's like a big brand name, it feels really formal. So it creates kind of more pressure on me to make sure that I build rapport and familiarity with people when I'm using this big old name. So that's the story of my name.
Thank you very much, Catherine Crystal Foster.
I
Who'd like to go next? And everyone doesn't have to, but anyone else would like to share?
I can go next, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so my last name Hansen. I guess Emily's a name I share with Emily. I learned only when I was 13, when my dad passed away, that my last name, his last name, which I thought was Hansen, wasn't. It was Talbot. And so I learned then that it was his grandfather had adopted him, which is a story that somehow was not told in their family up until that point. And so I long thought I had Danish, and I've since learned that Hansen with an EN is Danish, I'm told, and ON I think is maybe Norwegian or Swedish, I'm not sure. So I've had this connection to Denmark, sort of, for my whole life. And it's a lovely country I visited once, but certainly a surprise when I learned.
Thank you so much for sharing. I think we have time for a few more. I saw you unmuted.
I can go. Yeah. Hey, all. I'm David Beamsdiffer. I'm with United Philanthropy Forum. And I can't say much about my first name. I think, and my last name is, of course, what everyone's interested in. And I don't know much about it other than it's German for sure. And it used to be even longer. It used to be Bimmersdorfer. And it got shortened to Beamsdorfer. So that's about all I have to say about it.
We appreciate you sharing, David. And I think we're kind of down just to our two guest speakers, the women of the hour. Is there anything that the two of you would like to share just about the origins of your name?
I can share. So I'm from Bangladesh, and my name comes from a conversation that my grandmother had with my grandfather. She was illiterate, and he would read these French novels to her. And in one of the novels was character Princess Maria. And my mother basically said, hell no, and compromised with Mariana. And that's how I got the name. So I'm glad I'm not a Princess Maria.
Thank you, Mariana.
I can jump in and I guess do two things. One, I can share the story of my name, and then I'm happy to jump right into the case study. And so we have just a few slides that we wanted to go over with you all, and then are really excited to get into some questions and discussion. But my name, so Leah is a biblical name, and so came from the Bible, but my middle names, I have two middle names. Everyone in my family has two middle names. And so my middle names are Mary Saroja, and so named after each one of my grandmothers on my father's side and on my mother's side. And I have to say, I absolutely love that icebreaker. So selfishly, I'm glad that we were all stuck in one breakout room together, because it's just so wonderful to hear the origins of folks' names, and just to really come to this conversation understanding that there's so much depth to us, right? We're not one dimensional. And so it's really nice to just take a moment this afternoon to actually learn more about you in that way. So thanks for taking the time to do that. As Malcolm said, Mariana and I are going to talk about the work of the Schott Foundation, of which we both are working. And as Malcolm noted, today is my 1-year anniversary. And so part of how we want to do this conversation is to, as I said, go through some slides that are really for just sort of lay of the land context setting, and then engage in a little bit of kind of interview style, a little bit more discussion style, where I'm going to pose a few questions and Mariana will pose questions to myself, but really sort of have sort of some questions between each other to give you more of the nuts and bolts of the Loving Communities Response Fund, which is what we'll get into greater depth on. And then again, are really excited to engage with you all in questions and answers and want to learn more about the work that you all are doing. So hopefully you all will be open and are welcome to engage in that way. So just to sort of kick it off, the Schott Foundation for Public Education is an intermediary organization. We really serve as a bridge organization connecting philanthropy and grassroots organizations. Our work is really focused on increasing the investment that's made in K-12 education, justice movement building. When it comes to K-12 education, I should back up and say we look at the entire continuum of education. So historically, Schott has done some work in early childhood, but we are more squarely focused on just the incredible challenges and opportunities that are present in K-12 public education. And so when we talk about education, we are sort of focused on that K-12 part of the continuum. When it comes to K-12 education, we work from the frame that racial equity addresses the achievement gap and that racial justice really addresses the underlying opportunity gap, opportunity gaps. And that there's no pitting against each other, but that we actually need both in order to really see the kinds of transformational changes that we desire in the system and in the structures that get us to a place where children, all children really do have opportunities to learn. Our work, again, is really focused on increasing the investment in racial justice. We, this is April, so almost 2 months ago, really, the end of February, early March, launched a data project that we did with Candid, which was formerly the Nonprofit Center. And this data that we released really was looking at the investments that are made in racial equity in K-12 education and racial justice in K-12 education. And what we found, and it was not necessarily a surprise to us because we've been in this work so long, but it still was pretty astonishing that out of about $14 billion that is invested in K-12 education, less than 1%, in fact, 0.8%, actually goes to racial justice work in education. And so what we really are focused on is trying to increase that investment, both from a dollar standpoint and also increase the dependency and respect that folks have for racial justice work in the education space. Malcolm, if you could go to the next slide, that would be wonderful. Okay, so what does that investment in education justice look like? Again, we strongly believe that you cannot get to education equity without justice, and that these work together. And so for us, that investment looks like investing in education justice organizations really builds the public support that we need. And then that public support builds the demands for policy change that we want to see. And that policy change will hopefully lead to more funding and more resources that are equitable and where we'll see better outcomes for children and families. So that's kind of our theory of change for a very researchy word. You can go to the next slide. So this investment in the justice movement or justice work is operationalized for the Schott Foundation through a network of just amazing organizations called the National Opportunity to Learn Network. This network was founded in 2008 and actually started off as the Opportunity to Learn campaign. But our partners really, and this is a theme that should hopefully come through everything we say, is that we co-create, collaborate, lean deeply into the expertise and experience of our partners. I mean, we really see our partners as the leaders and experts in this work. And so partners really said to the foundation, we feel like campaign just sounds like a one and done, like we've accomplished our goal and now we're moving on from each other. And in fact, did not want that kind of relationship, really saw the power of coming together and really coalescing as an organized body. And so we shifted from the campaign to the opportunity to learn network. And so that network is made up of about 40 organizations. There are 4 national partners, and these organizations are networks themselves. So they are alliances. And then we have a number of, we partner with a number of grassroots organizations. And so you can see here on the slide that partnership, this network of about 40 organizations really represents over 800,000 constituents across the United States. And so, yeah, so what we're doing is we are investing in these organizations in the work that they're doing. So for example, in 2020, as many of us experienced and are experiencing so much from that year, and as we really saw this tipping point, unfortunately, honestly, a tipping point in the awareness that folks were having around police brutality. And for an education organization, what we understood and what our partners understood was that the police brutality that we were seeing on TV with adults, and I put that in quotes because we know that the age ranges were everywhere from 13, 12 to older folks. But that this same sort of brutality, disrespect, harm was also happening in schools. And so many of our partners have taken up the really important work of campaigns for police-free schools and really thinking about and advocating for and working towards ensuring that schools are places where at a minimum, children are safe. And so that would be just one example. They're working on lots of other kinds of work as well. Education funding formulas. We had a big victory in New York with one of our partners, the Alliance for Quality Education. But that's just one example of the type of work, our campaigns and efforts that our partners are really leading. And our work is to support them through financial investment, but then also technical assistance and other resources, amplifying, elevating their voices through communication, through strategic communications and other mediums. We can go to the next slide. So what I'd like to do now is one, sort of pick up on this sort of reminder or notion of what was happening in March of 2020. March of 2020, the Schott Foundation, and Marianna's going to go into more detail, was like many people thinking about reflecting rapidly, paying attention to what was happening in the world and trying to figure out, what do we do? How do we support these incredible needs that we're hearing from our partners, that we are not only hearing, but experiencing ourselves and seeing front hands in the communities that we care so much about. And so the organization, in partnership with our national partners in particular, whose logos you can see here on the slide, co-created and then co-launched the Loving Communities Response Fund for Racial Justice. So I'm going to pause there, I'll stop, and turn it over to Marianna, and really just start off by asking Marianna to draw maybe a even clearer picture of what was happening at the Schott Foundation during that time, sort of like what were the conversations that were occurring that brought the organization to feeling like this response fund was the right thing to do.
Thank you, Leah. And thank you everyone for participating today. So a couple of things I want to lift up from Leah's presentation that I think is really important to note is Schott Foundation. We're a racial justice organization. We started off as a private family foundation, and then we became a public philanthropic fund in 2007. And what that meant was almost overnight, because there was a commitment, we became a majority people of color board and also a majority of people of color on staff. And that's particularly important to note because, and also like the development of the networks Leah had mentioned, In many instances, we were the first funder at the table, or we actually helped to create a network. Because at the time, what we were seeing across the country was, individual school districts struggling to meet the needs of students. So there really wasn't a full education justice movement that we have now, one that's actually impacted, the presidential platform even. And so we were very much a part of helping to create those networks. And also in some instances, we're a member of those networks. And so this is us sort of meeting the moment, because we're very familiar with the communities that we serve and the needs that are there. Some of us come from the set of experiences that we're working to address. And so just wanted to highlight that. But without re-traumatizing all of us about what was happening around this time last year, I mean, we were all fearful, right? It was a real tumultuous moment. Staff was also contending with what we were going to do with our lives now that schools were closed. And, we wanted to make sure that our elders were being taken care of, and that our families were also situated. And so we were doing much of that, but because we use a racial justice lens to our work, we acknowledge that organizers are also frontline workers. And so this is really important for us, because they're responding to some of the most immediate needs of their communities and helping to advance movements that can make their communities more equitable and just. And we knew this pandemic was going to exacerbate the existing inequities in our communities. And so that was something that we kept talking about. And so Leah mentions that, talks about our Opportunity to Learn network, which is really largely a BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color led grassroots organizations who are working with residents and communities that include people most adversely impacted by the social structures, including those living, below the poverty line, low wage earners, people living in communities essentially with systems, whether it be school, government, healthcare, or business, that has really had a challenging and unjust history and an earned reputation for being unresponsive to their needs. So in many ways, the Response Fund was created to ensure that the most immediate needs of our grantee partners, their membership base, were met. And we did that by leveraging the most important thing that we had, which was trust. We had built, years of trust with our partners. And that includes our national, state, and local partners that we've supported over the years. And the way we did that was by working with initially 3 of our national partner networks, who all had local chapters. And that's how we were able to really launch the fund. And later we added 1 more national partner, and we can certainly talk about that too.
Thank you. Perfect timing, Malcolm. So when you talk a bit about the importance of participatory grant making as the model of grant making that was decided upon, I mean, I know today's session or today's conference has really been focused on this question around ensuring greater equity in giving and sort of what we've learned from research experience that gets us there. And so I just wondered if we could talk a bit about the participatory grant making process and like how that came to be the selected process. And then kind of like what is so important about using that type of grant making structure?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and especially in this rapid response mode, I think it was especially important to lean in to our partners, but not make this sort of an elaborate exercise in participatory grant making. And so we basically leaned in and said, how can we execute getting resources out to communities most impacted? And what we got was really, a variation of how to approach that, which we were really open to. So maybe it'll be helpful to hear a little bit more of who our partners are. So one of our partners is the Alliance to Reclaim Our Schools. It's the largest community and labor partnership in the country, and it brings together the two largest teachers unions with other labor and racial justice organizations. We also work with Journey for Justice Alliance, which is an alliance of Black and Brown-led organizations that are fighting for education justice in, I believe, 34 cities and rural communities. And we also worked with the Dignity in Schools campaign, which is primarily a network of Black and Brown parents working to dismantle the school to prison pipeline. And they're in over 100 cities and rural communities throughout the country. And later we were joined by the Alliance for Educational Justice. And so, Schott's role was, what we decided was Schott's role was, one, to create a mechanism for joint fundraising, but doing most of the heavy lifting, as I said, and two, to move the money as expeditiously as possible, making it as easy as possible for, to move those dollars. And in fact, we created a 5-minute application that initially we took over the phone with our partners because people weren't, Zoom ready yet at that time. And so we were, having these phone calls talking about, what were the needs and so forth. And, our partners' role was primarily to provide the thought leadership for the fund and advise on how and where to direct the resources. And like I mentioned, this happened in varied ways. And so one of our partners created an internal review process. So they really wanted to empower their members to apply for the funds and also be part of the review process. And so this national network brought folks together within their network to be able to do that and help expedite getting funds where they were most needed. Another partner reached in with their local chapters, doing one-on-ones and assessing the needs and then prioritizing the funding for the groups. And they would just let us know that these are the groups that we should be moving dollars to. And then of course, on our end, it was followed up by, outreaching to these groups, having a conversation and getting these really 5-minute applications back.
And I saw some head nods and kind of looks of surprise around the 5-minute application. So we might have a question or two that gets us a little bit more into how we got to a 5-minute application. And I think it speaks to, Marianna, your point around really trust and trusting that you get the information, you can get as much information as you need with the right sort of conversations, and it's not necessarily about lengthy paperwork. But wanted to just ask you if you might say a bit more about kind of who was supported by the funds and what were some of the needs that were lifted up by partners.
Yeah. So the fund supported 70 grants to organizations in 19 states and Puerto Rico. And the needs identified by groups range from food, materials, outreach, bridging the technology gap, and also directing financial support. And so what happened from there was actually really amazing. And so organizers began to develop mutual aid networks in their communities to engage the community in more sustained support because so much was unknown at the time. And wasn't sure if this is going to be like a 3-month moment or even longer. But because again, our organizers, our network and Schott, we really focus on a racial justice lens. We approach things with a healthy skepticism and knowing that, this is also a moment to ask for what it is that we need and not go back to normal because normal wasn't working for our communities anyways. And so organizers not only gave out, some, practical support, but also developed new infrastructure and a system of delivery and engagement that has been really needed in our communities. And I just want to highlight a few. And so one organization that comes to mind is in the south side of Chicago, and they created a program called Coco Serves. And essentially they said, this is a moment to engage young people in their leadership to actually plan for and implement the distribution of food and supplies to residents in need. And they have, quickly become a model in our network to leverage mutual aid to organize and bring people together to advocate for their needs. So beyond just, providing groceries and materials and supplies, they're also thinking about like, how to get fresh foods and vegetables into the communities where there are food deserts. So it's really sort of bigger than the moment, right? And our in one of the organizations that we supported, they used our initial grant funding to establish a fund for undocumented folks, which ended up raising over $1 million for undocumented families in Massachusetts. So it was a conversation about like, where's the need? It was with undocumented people. They were not able to receive public benefits in Massachusetts, and they were getting laid off as businesses were closing. And so the initial investment actually created an even bigger investment in this state. Coincidentally, the state I'm in. And, these groups help to advise other communities looking to do the same. So, where, one community was able to develop the mutual aid network through an online database, they were also able to assist other communities that, were desiring to do the same. And I just want to emphasize that the needs continue to be ongoing. And many of our grantee partners, work in partnership with others to develop a new mechanism to deliver this type of support. And it's been especially helpful as there's been, vaccination outreach and support to communities that are hard to, outreach to. And so they've been able to develop strategies and approaches to address that.
So just thinking a bit about, I'm kind of reflecting on some of what you stated and thinking about two things that you said is one, that these immediate needs don't stop there, right? They haven't stopped, they're ongoing. These are ongoing needs, and these are needs that existed before 2020 and continue to exist. So I'm thinking about that point, and then also thinking about, the fact that the fund is literally called the Loving Communities Response Fund for Racial Justice, and wanting you to maybe say something to us about what it means for an education focused or education justice organization, what it means for the education justice movement. What does it mean to strategically invest in education justice? And why is that important to racial justice?
Mm-hmm. No, that's a really wonderful question. Education is racial justice. Education justice is racial justice. And that's something that you hear so many within our network continue to remind folks. And, it's really important, I think, that folks know that, individual schools and systems won't change themselves, and it really requires a demand from folks who are really informed and engaged and organized to be able to, make the types of changes that we want to see in society. And that is a long process, right? Organizing is not something that is one and done. And so, you can have, one of the challenges during the pandemic was, bridging the technology gap, right? There were a lot of students who didn't have access to Wi-Fi in their communities, and the infrastructure wasn't there, and neither was the technology, the actual, laptops and things like that, cell phones. And so, that only goes so far, right? That doesn't necessarily mean that education is happening, right? Or that, young people are able to, able to participate in that effectively. And so, so there's a lot more conversations to be had around equity and access and opportunity. And that is best done by engaging people who are most impacted in those communities. And so, so I hope that answers that question.
No, that's great. And it's funny because we've obviously been colleagues for a year. And so sometimes, well, not even sometimes, like a lot of times you're so into the work that you don't actually sit down and kind of interview each other or talk in this way. So I have to just admit, I have learned a lot in this conversation with you all. And so I'm super grateful for that. And Marianna, you named a number of things and a couple of lessons that I sort of took some notes on around like the process and the application, like literally just thinking about some of the administrative obstacles that are often present in these kinds of processes. You talked about the importance of trust in each other and really leaning into the expertise and experience of those most impacted. And that this is not a one-time event, right? That these needs are ongoing. And so we have to act in sort of this rapid responsive way forever is ideally what we should be doing. I wondered if there were just any other lessons learned that you might want to share with the group before we close out this part of the presentation.
Yeah, I think number one is you can create a 5-minute application if the trust is there, right? So that is one. Another is, like we keep saying, the people most impacted can tell us where it's needed if there's a scaffolding of support for that. And we actually built that before we even ventured into this participatory grant making process. So the rapid response grant making, really made a lot of sense from that perspective. And then, funding movement building is funding a network of organizations. And so that's really important. It's not about funding one specific organization, but the network that really relies on each other, to build that movement and to build the type of momentum that we want to have. I would say tap into the leadership of those networks to advise and co-develop the strategy. So that's really important. And being really patient and discerning, where you need to step up as a foundation or where you need to kind of step back. And I think, there were many moments where we were able to do that, where, I think there were moments where we're like, oh, we have this idea, but folks didn't really have the capacity for it because, again, people were contending with their own lives and that of their networks. And so we tabled some ideas. And then, yeah, I guess that this crisis is not over. And so this is not about, again, just doing charity. This is really about building solidarity, which is what we need to be sort of a healthier society that is, values continuous improvement.